So I have a great pleasure to introduce our next speaker, Professor Neda Zawahri, who is an associate professor of political science at Cleveland State University. Now, Neda works on transboundary issues. She has done some work on in Asia, but also recently, if I understand correctly, in the Middle East regarding Jordan, the Euphrates, and the Tigris rivers. So, yeah, very appropriate to our. I'm sorry. Very appropriate to our to the topic of the day, and the exact title of her presentation is "Adopting or Adapting." I cannot distinguish between the A and the O, but both may work. To climate change in the Middle East, even though I know that there is an American leader who recently claimed that there is no climate change. So I don't know. Neda, please.
So the topic that I'm going to talk about changed a little bit when I went to write it, and it's going to touch upon climate change, but it's also going to touch upon, thank you, population growth, ineffective management, water security, and I'll also talk to you about my most recent research about water in conflict zones and the targeting of water in conflict zones. Okay. Usually I'm too loud, but I'll do my best. There we go. Let's see. So this is the region I'm going to talk to you about today, the Middle East and North Africa. And these are the images that we see on the news, on the evening news. So, but what I'll propose to you is that while we see conflict, instability, and turmoil in places like Syria, Iraq, Yemen, and Libya, and these conflicts are threatening neighboring states in the region, there's a potentially more pressing concern that can cause additional instability in the region, and this is the issue of water that we've been hearing about and talking about today. Now, due to the region's relative aridity, it's an arid and semi-arid environment. And if you look at that map, it's one of the most arid regions in the world. 85% of the land, in fact, is arid. It is really one of the most water-stressed regions in the world. They contain 6% of the world's population, but it has less than 2% of the world's water resources. And if you look at the various regions in the world, how much water is in Asia versus Africa versus MENA, you can see it's really very short in terms of water supply. And in fact, the 12 most water-scarce states in the world are located in the MENA. And because of several factors that I'm going to talk to you about today, look at the region. You have various states that have absolute water scarcity and states with water scarcity. Because of the combination of climate change, population growth, mismanagement of existing supplies, you're going to see in the future more states cross into the absolute scarcity level of water. So what are the factors that are complicating the region's water crisis and making it a potential both internal threat and regional threat? The combination of population growth, socioeconomic development. We'll talk about climate change today and its impact. And as we've heard about, ineffective management of very scarce water supplies. So let's look at population growth. The region has some of the highest population growth rates in the world. Jordan in 2015 had a 3% population growth rate. That does not take into account the Syrian refugees that are flooding the country. There's an estimate of having 1.2 million Syrian refugees. Those are registered and unregistered refugees. Oman has a 7.9% population growth rate. Yemen is 2.5%. Saudi Arabia is 2.3%. As a result, they're expecting MENA's population to increase from 480 million to 771 million by 2015, and that will be a 57% increase in the population. The other factor is that it's going to create tremendous pressure on the region's water supply. And in addition, as we have these population growths, there's socioeconomic development and improvement in living standards. And so the domestic consumption of water has also increased, especially in major cities, such as in Amman, in Beirut, across the region. The other factor that's complicating this demand for water is climate change. Now, climate change models are predicting that the region is going to see an increase in temperature between 1 to 2 degrees centigrade by 2030. And by 2065, it's expected to go up to 3 degrees. And the precipitation rate is expected to decrease between 10 to 20% by 2030, along with an increase in evaporation. Also, the models tell us that there's going to be an increased frequency of droughts, and the droughts are going to not only be more frequent in the future, but they're going to last a lot longer. Flash floods are going to increase in occurrence, and extreme heat. So the models are predicting the future, but in fact, what regional analysts have shown us is we've already been experiencing this impact of climate change. So the region has been getting hotter. The precipitation patterns have been shifting in the region, and also the droughts. Droughts used to occur once every 15 years. Now they're occurring once every 20 years, even more often, and they're hanging along, staying present much, much longer, so that we're having droughts for consecutive years, a lot longer than they've done in the past. Flash floods are already causing havoc and damage because the region has not built the infrastructure to either capture the flash floods or to protect cities or infrastructure from flash floods. So the most recent round of flash floods have caused havoc in the Gaza Strip, in Saudi Arabia, in the Persian Gulf region. So the region has to start preparing for climate change. I did field research in 2012, and I was talking to experts and government officials about climate change, and their response was, what are you talking about climate change? We're thinking about this summer. How are we going to respond to this summer? Change it to now, 2015 and 2016, they're realizing, especially because of this massive drought that they had in 2011 and the social protests that I'll talk to you about later on that took place in 2011 because of the drought, ineffective governance we'll talk about later. They're now realizing that we must start preparing for it, and a couple of things are happening. So one thing they're doing is they're going to the donor community and saying, hey, look, climate change is coming. It's already here, we have to prepare. So they're using it to, what we say in social science, frame the crisis and put it in the dialect and in the terms that the donor community understands. And second of all, the donor community is realizing, especially with what I'll talk to you a little bit about Syria, they're realizing that the infrastructure is really not there, the institutional development is not there, so they're realizing that we need to help build adaptive capacity. So it's a very important shift from 2012 to 2015, 2016. Now, climate change is important, and here is what its impact. It's going to have an increased demand on the region, but here's what's more important. It's only 20%, right? So if you look at the contribution to the water shortages in the region, 20% is driven by climate change. 80% is population growth. Okay, so those experts that combine both the models that we have about climate change with our understanding about population growth and socioeconomic development, what do they say? What do they tell us about the future supply? First, we can expect by 2050 that there's going to be 50% increase in demand for additional water supplies, and unmet demand will increase by 370% in the region. Those that study 2030, they expect an increase in demand by 47%. So certainly the combination of these factors is not a good prognosis for the region. And the concern is that it'll add to additional political instability domestically because of social pressures that I'll talk to you about, and regionally because of the competition over transboundary aquifers and transboundary rivers. So the other factor contributing is ineffective and inefficient management of existing water supplies in the region. 85% of the water in the region is being used by the agricultural sector. It is fair to note, as we've heard today, that this is just an average of the region. It varies, so I can give you some numbers. In places like Jordan, Israel, and Palestine, it's 65% of the domestic water. In Saudi Arabia, Oman, Yemen, it's 85%. So it does vary. Israel, as we've heard today, has done a tremendous amount in saving water in the agriculture sector, switching to treated wastewater. Jordan is following suit. The Palestinians, the interesting thing is that they've worked on the farm. They've incorporated this knowledge into their own farm agricultural sector, and so have the Jordanians. But we have a long way to go to make it more efficient. Now, a couple of things are happening. Despite the fact that water in the region is very scarce, it's also very cheap. So water is heavily subsidized by the agricultural, for the government, for the agricultural sector, and for the municipal sector. So farmers pay very, very little in terms of for fresh water supplies. That's very scarce. And their use, especially in places like Jordan, for crops that are water intensive, and they don't have the most efficient technology because of several factors. One of them is lack of capital resources, lack of a strong government that is able to distribute the latest technology to them. The other thing is the municipal sector. So you have a lot of subsidies. Water is very cheap. It's scarce, right? Because in places like Jordan and Amman, if some of you have been there, you know that water will come one day a week, and by the end of the week, you're out of water. But you don't pay a lot of money for that water. They're very efficient in using that water because it's scarce, not because it's expensive. But what does that mean? It means that you have wealthy upper-class people that have the financial resources that are paying very little for their water. They have the ability to pay for it. They can afford to have swimming pools. They can afford to go to the private sector and have green lawns. The other thing you have are foreigners, right? Expats, taking advantage of the subsidies and living a very nice lifestyle. So if you go to western part of Amman, you have maids outside with their hoses washing the driveway, washing the car, and cleaning so that they don't have to dust so much the next day, because you can get rid of the dust and it won't come into the house. So if you look at Jordanians themselves, the average person is very efficient in their use of water, only because they've had to do so. It's very difficult to get a hold of water, right, for the average family. But because it's so cheap, you have the upper class and the foreign workers and the expats that are taking advantage of subsidies that should really be going to those that need them. Okay. So the other thing that is going on, in addition to inefficient management, is that the states are, like we've heard today, they're looking to augment supplies always. They prefer to avoid upsetting the sleeping tiger, if you will. They avoid upsetting state-society relations, and they're constantly looking to augment supplies and not improve the efficiency of their domestic management of water resources. So we have the highest desalination capacity in the world in the Middle East. So in fact, according to the World Bank, 75% of the world's desalinized capacity is located in the oil-rich Gulf states, Saudi Arabia, and Israel. Now, even energy-poor states are looking to desalinization in order to meet their ever-increasing demand. So what policymakers are focused on is very short-term. What do I need to do to get more water for my summer, next summer, the summer after that? And it's never long-term. What do I need to look to manage this resource more efficiently? So even energy-poor Jordan is looking to the Red Sea, Dead Sea. They've found funding. The U.S. government is quite excited. I don't know how to use this light. There it is. I got this one. Okay. So phase 1 of the Red Sea, Dead Sea has received funding. We're going to start building a desalination plant in Aqaba on the Jordanian side. The water will go to Eilat. It's the first phase trilateral agreement between Israel, Palestine, and Jordan to begin the process of building this Red Sea, Dead Sea canal. The water will go to Israel, 50 million cubic meters, and Jordan will get the return water from the north, and so they've received funding. So everybody's looking to desalination as the answer for the future. Even the Palestinians, they would love to start building desalination plants to help them augment their water supply. So the other thing that they're doing in the process is that we've heard about, they're over-extracting their domestic water supplies. So along with ineffective management, the consequence have been that very scarce groundwater aquifer is being depleted at an unsustainable rate. They withdraw. So I can give you, for example, in Saudi Arabia, it has the oldest aquifer system in the world. It's being extracted by 954% beyond its capacity. And we have also in Jordan, the aquifers are in great danger, and they're about to be exhausted. The expectation was that they would be exhausted by 2025, but they've had to adjust because of the pressure from refugees on the country that it's actually going to be exhausted a lot sooner than expected within the next couple of years. So if you look at that map, it has one of the highest resource withdrawal rates in the world. Also, the transboundary rivers have not done as well either, right? So we've overexploited our groundwater resources. If you look at the Jordan River, it actually stops at this point, right? The waters of the Jordan River itself stop at that point. The rest of the water from, sorry? Can somebody help me with the arrow? This technical help, please. Thank you.
Push this guy, the green one.
Okay, got it. So here, let's try to do this. Thank you. From here to the Dead Sea, that's no longer Jordan River water. So if you ever go to the Jordan River, don't put your hands in the water. That's mostly agricultural runoff, water from fisheries that are there, and sometimes treated water if the farmers don't use it up. It ends up being dumped there in some parts of Jordan. So the Jordan River does not feed the Dead Sea anymore, and that's why the Dead Sea has been shrinking, and it's no longer one sea. This is the Dead Sea, in fact, is divided into two, and the bottom part of the Dead Sea is shrinking tremendously. So one of the arguments for building the Red Sea, Dead Sea Canal is to bring water from the Red Sea to the Dead Sea to replenish the Dead Sea, but the environmentalists will tell you this is not the same water as the fresh water from the Jordan River itself, and it will harm the ecosystem and the minerals. The mineral companies are afraid that they will not be able to extract the minerals that they have historically. So the other thing is the Euphrates and Tigris rivers have not fared as well. Those that have studied the impact of climate change on these rivers and the demand, they've concluded that those rivers are closed, that at this moment they're able to meet the local demands and the ecosystem. Any additional demands will harm the basins. So transboundary rivers, let's talk about transboundary rivers. In the region, over 66% of the region's water supply comes from transboundary rivers. Over 66% of the water supply. So if you look at Syria, its domestic water supply, 85% of it comes from the Euphrates River. So it's heavily dependent on the Euphrates River. The Euphrates River is fed by rainfall in southeastern Turkey, and it's very important to Syria, to Iraq. If you look at Iraq, its dry, arid land comes to life really from the Euphrates and Tigris. Similar story with Egypt. The Nile is Egypt's lifeline. Now, how about governance? while there has been ineffective governments of transboundary rivers in the Middle East also. But here's what's interesting. You can take the same story and apply it to South Asia. Okay, so this is not unique of the Middle East. States tend to have this preference for fragmented governance, what I call fragmented governments of their transboundary rivers. It's very difficult to get all the riparian states in one room and tell them negotiate a treaty. They don't like that. And we know from quantitative analysis, whether it's India in South Asia or Israel in the Jordan Basin or Turkey in the Euphrates and Tigris basins or Egypt in the Nile, we know for a fact here power matters. Powerful states do not like to sit in a room with weaker states. What are they going to do? They're going to gang up on you and you're not going to get your interest. So the idea of it's an empirical analysis. If you want to talk about it afterwards, I'm very glad to give you the empirical literature on it. Take any issue, there's this idea of I want to negotiate bilateral agreements. That gives me the upper hand in negotiating treaties. So you have throughout the region a preference for bilateral agreements. What's wrong with bilateral agreements? They're extremely inefficient. Take, for instance, the Euphrates and Tigris rivers, right? There are two bilateral agreements. They're not full treaties or agreements. They're simple one-letter protocol or one-paragraph protocol, but at least it's a commitment, right? So you have one between Syria and Turkey and between Syria and Iraq. Okay, so Syria and Turkey, it's fixed numbers. I'm going to discharge this quantity of water. With Syria and Iraq, it's percentage. Well, what happens when Turkey doesn't meet the demand? Syria says, well, I can't give you all that water because Turkey didn't give me that water. Iraq blames Syria for it. The same thing happens along the Jordan River. So there's an agreement between Jordan and Syria on the Yarmouk, and then another agreement between Jordan and Israel. What happens when Syria withdraws more water? And then there's no water in the Yarmouk. What do you say to Israel? So we had a discussion today. We heard about desalinization. What has happened is that because of Israel building desalinization plants along the Mediterranean Sea, this has allowed it to be much more generous with Jordan, right? So if the water is not there, okay, we'll negotiate something else, right? But if those desalinization plants had not been built, then there would be a lot more, tension in accounting for it. So I can tell you throughout the world, this is what we see. Fragmented government is inefficient. It doesn't allow you to internalize externalities such as pollution. It's ineffective management of the basin. It's unsustainable. And it ultimately leads to more tension. The other thing that we see is the treaties tend to focus on quantitative allocation of the waters versus percentages. And they also tend to discard qualitative issue. The environment tends to be neglected and ignored. Groundwater resources tend to be neglected and ignored. And they don't take into account climate change, right? And climate change is something new that the region is waking up to and realizing it. So we can't blame them too much for discounting it, but this is something that they have to take into account in the future. There's also a disregard for the integrated management of a basin. This is general, right? I can take these critiques and apply them to most treaties. I can apply it to the Indus very simply, okay? But still, it's not an excuse for the region's leaders. It's something that we can work towards improving in the future. Now, because of its scarcity, because of the region's aridity, we know that in this region, water has a multidimensional security perspective. It's related to human security, it's related to political stability, it's related to national security, and it's also a weapon that is used in wars and in conflicts. So let's look at human security. Before that, let's look at this quote. So the US intelligence community came together in 2012 and produced this report, Global Water Security. And they said water problems, when combined with poverty, social tensions, environmental degradation, ineffective leadership, and weak political institution, they contribute to social disruptions that can result in state failure. I will tell you a little bit more about that today, but this is kind of what we've seen. It's really important to note first that water is not the cause of the current Arab uprisings. It's not that one day they woke up in the Middle East and said, there's no water, it's your fault. It's not a single dominant independent variable, but it is an intervening variable. It is a threat multiplier, what we call in the literature. It is part of this whole compass of ideas that we have ineffective regimes that at a minimum could easily provide us sufficient clean water. So it is certainly a threat multiplier that when it's combined with other features can contribute to instability domestically and regionally. So let's look at human security. If you look at the Arab world, it is one of the most scarce, as we've been mentioning, in terms of water resources. According to the World Bank, anything below 500 million cubic meters of water is considered what's known as a water barrier to growth, because with less water, what people tend to do, their whole life becomes focused on water scarcity, and economic development will be hampered. So water is certainly related to individual human security. I mean, I can tell you in Jordan, people spend a lot of their time focused on securing sufficient quantities of water for the household. When water comes, people are home there, because this is when they clean the house, do the laundry, because they don't know in a couple of days if they're going to have any water. So the per capita water availability is actually below 200 cubic meters in Jordan, Yemen, Saudi Arabia, and the Gulf states. As we've heard today, in Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states, the way they have managed it is by building desalination plants. In Jordan and Yemen, it has, they don't have the financial or political stability, if you will, of choosing that route. Jordan is hoping to with the assistance from the international donor community. But there's definitely, and climate change is expecting that number to actually decrease in the future. And as we've heard today, Yemen is running out of water and it's in desperate need of water. Yemen's unique because it has political instability as part of its water crisis in the equation. So clean household water is really essential. It's necessary for human health, for poverty reduction, for social dignity. Otherwise, contaminated water can endanger the well-being of families through waterborne diseases and inflict financial health costs along with other economic losses for a sick family member who is unable to work, and you have this added pressure of a medical bill. Okay, so let's look, this is poor water quality. Its impact mostly on children and women. So let's look at this. If you look at the number, there's recently the Millennium Development Goals that were mentioned earlier today. If you look at the Millennium Development Goals and you look at the Middle East, they're awesome. They're doing great. They are providing, on average for the region, 90% of water to the residents for urban areas is piped. So Jordan looks great in numbers. But here's the problem. A couple of things. If you look at rural areas, they don't do as well. And if you look at water quality, which is not put up there, they also don't do as well. So for example, in rural areas, it's a lot less. Look at Morocco. Morocco does really well in urban areas. But if you look at rural areas, Morocco is 47%. I'm sorry, Morocco is 65% in the villages. And 23% of those received pipe water to the household. Yemen, 47% are served in the rural areas, and 26% received piped water. If you look at water quality, they're not as doing as well either, the whole region, with exception, of course, of the Persian Gulf, because they relied on desalinized water. But for example, water, anybody been to Amman recently or in the past? Yeah, don't drink tap water, right? The first thing you do, and make sure all your food is cooked. Yeah, so that you get outbreaks of, and it's not, here's the thing with places like Jordan, when the water leaves the treatment plant, it's perfect, it's clean. It's by the time it gets to your tap, that's when it gets contaminated. It gets contaminated in the roofs with the roof tanks where you store your water, and it gets in the transportation network, it gets contaminated. So we have water quality issues and we have water problems in the rural areas. So according to the World Bank, the degradation of MENA's water supply is a drain not only on human welfare, but also on the national economy. I also wanted to show you Lebanon. So in Lebanon, it also does not do well in villages, but I also wanted to show you this as an example. It's really hard to get data in the Middle East. It's hard to do studies on climate change. It's also hard to do studies on things like this. How much time? I'm okay. All right. Let's talk about political stability. Political stability. So the same report says when populations believe water shortages are the result of poor governance, hoarding, or control of water by the elites, it can contribute to destabilizing protests. So we saw these destabilizing protests in 2011 when the Arab Spring, as it's called, or the Arab Uprising, as it's called, swept across the region in North Africa and the Middle East. And if you looked at news reports, or if you looked at the chanting that was going on, it was a basket full of issues, part of which were jobs, food, high prices of food, and insufficient water, especially in places like Jordan, where in the rural areas, it's really, places like Karak, it was really hard to secure sufficient access to water. So water, again, is a threat multiplier. If you look at Syria, from 2006 to 2011, there was this severe drought that harmed severely the agricultural sector. So it was a drought that impacted people's food security, combined with a weak government that didn't have the infrastructure to send food or to keep people in the village, migration to the cities that added pressure on the scarce resources of the country. So it's interesting that the protests began in Dira, which is an agricultural community along the Yarmouk River, right across the border from Jordan. So a lot of people have been arguing that this drought and the ineffective institutions, and even when the international donor community wanted to come in and say, here's some food aid, distribute food, they didn't have the infrastructure to take advantage of it. Okay, so it's a threat multiplier. It's also part of national security in terms of the region. Transboundary rivers they're like a political lever that states use against each other. So when I'm pissed off at my neighbor, I can do a couple of things, whether it's India or Pakistan or Turkey and Syria. A couple of things I can do is at night when they don't have the capacity to store the water, I'll just flood them with water. And during the day when they really need it, I'll slow it down. Okay, so data, hydrological data is really important. Without knowing that there was not enough rain in southeastern Turkey, Syria and Iraq can't prepare for drought or floods, right? Or anything, or water shortage. So I'll give them bad data. Oh my goodness, my machines broke down, right? India can do this to Pakistan, and other states can do it to each other along rivers. So they're a political lever that states can use. They can use it in a way to diffuse tension or to punish without going to war. Withholding hydrological data and preventing preparations for droughts. Manipulating the river's flow is an excellent source. In fact, Turkey has built this very large dam right near the border with Syria. It's called the Kamesh Dam. So if you want to hear about it, we'll talk about it later. And this allows it to control the flow of the Euphrates. You reject upstream drainage if you want to punish the state. You refuse to coordinate and dredge the river. In fact, the reason why Israel and Jordan in the very first place began to hold discussions in the mid-1980s over the Yarmouk River was because they had to dredge it. The Yarmouk brought too much silt. It clogged the canal for bringing water into the Jordan Valley for Jordan, and then they had to have secret discussions, secret meetings to dredge the river so that the flow would continue and they could use the water. And you close your barrages to minor floods. War.
I think we should wrap up.
Okay, I'll wrap it up.
We want to leave some, I'm sure that there are a lot of questions.
Okay, I will.
Leave some time for that if you may.
Sure, I will, yes. So war and water. So during war, especially, I can tell you one of the projects we're working on is to look at how infrastructure is being bombed and targeted currently by the various wars across the Middle East. And so rivers and hydrological infrastructures in the current wars have become offensive and defensive weapons. ISIS has sought, you've seen it, I'm sure you've seen it in the news, to control dams, and others have tried to take it away from them. Terrorists can also target hydrological infrastructure. And if you want, in conclusion, I can talk about the policy shifts that are needed to improve the ability to manage the region's water supply and mitigate future tensions. That's it.
Thank you. Thank you,
Sorry.
Neda, for a very comprehensive overview. I must say you have touched on many of the issues that have already been raised, but from a different angle, like national security, through the climate prism and so forth. So thank you for a very eloquent presentation. And now I open the floor for questions, comment. Naftali.
Check 1, 2. Check. Check.
Okay, I have a question on the Red to Dead canal. It's really terrifying that they're going to bring all this saline water from the sea into the land. It can create a lot of problems in such a sensitive area. It's a desert, it's hyper-arid. If a drop of water, of saline water, will pour on the soil, it will be disaster for a long time. Now, this area has earthquake. This area is very sensitive to earthquake, and the next one is coming. We don't know when, but it will come, a big one.
Don't you want to be
It was in the past, and it will be in the future.
What do you mean?
And I wonder if in the project they are thinking about it, because I see that it's not in Israel now, it's going to be in Jordan. One of the reasons is that the environmentalists in Israel prevent this, but in Jordan the environmentalists are not so strong, so it's there now.
Yes.
And I'm afraid that we are going to a catastrophe. I'm just afraid that all this water, and in the end it's one region, and we maybe we're going to destroy the region by bringing wrong water to inland.
Okay, so a couple of things. There have been a lot of studies, because it's a World Bank. The study group was commissioned by the World Bank. So one of the studies is an environmental impact assessment, okay? And their concern is they never actually came out and said you're going to destroy the ecosystem, but they said we're very concerned about the ecosystem. Right now, the wastewater, the desalination plant is very, very small, and they think they can do it sustainably. In the future, if they go to the 100 million cubic meter desalination plant, then they will have to think about a lot more. So scientists are, warning of the danger, because the idea was to dump the saline into the Dead Sea, the lower part of the Dead Sea, and tell the potash plants to drill outside. So yeah, I can give you, tell you about the reports afterwards, but I'll be happy to discuss that with you.
Apropos desalinization, a thought that went through my mind when I heard you talk about desalination in Gaza. Well, donor countries have given money to set up desalination plants in Gaza. The problem is that they are dysfunctional because there's no energy to activate them. So they're there, but they're just standing there because lack of energy. So just as addendum to this. Yes, sir. Yeah. And then
I have two quick questions. With respect to your slide on Syria, I saw a report a couple of years ago by Thomas Friedman, Years of Living Dangerously, in which he termed what's happening in Syria the first climate war. He was talking about the water depletion induced partially by climate change. Do you think that was an accurate attribute by Thomas Friedman? Secondly, I read a report from the Max Planck Institute in Mainz, Germany, they released a statement that, according to the latest climate models, by the end of the century, the average global mean temperature in the Middle East will be 124 Fahrenheit, and mass migrations will be required then. Even at the midpoint of the century, they expect to have 45 million people have to immigrate from the area due to the climate change and the inhospitality of the region. What do you feel about that report from the Max Planck Institute?
Okay, so the Max Planck Institute is really an excellent institute. I have not read that report, but I will definitely look it up. As far as their figures, see what happens when you do climate change analysis. You have average, and then you have hyper-arid, and then you have somewhat. So you have 3 different readings. The data I gave you was average. It's very hard to know what's going to happen in the future because you don't know what the carbon emissions are. It's going to be, you don't know exactly how much. For example, in the case of Jordan, when we did model analysis for Jordan, we took the average Jordanian population growth rate. We never thought that there's going to be a conflict in Syria and the population is going to increase substantially. So Jordan's population, like all those models that were done were wrong because they discounted 1.2 million people. Well, when you're talking about 6 million people, 1.2 is a very significant number. So I'm wondering, I have not read that report, but I'm wondering if this is, they're giving you the number of the extreme hyperaridity report number. So I can tell you it's an excellent institute. They do great work. I can't comment on that report. As for Thomas Friedman and Syria, certainly the region has been really affected by climate change, and all the models show us that in the past it has become more arid. It was unsustainable, the use of water in the region, especially in Syria, parts of it were hyper-arid. So yeah, it was a good foresight by him to say that. Yes?
I'm not sure. Do I need to do anything? Oh, there it goes. Okay. So for a while in the literature on transboundary cooperation and conflict, there was a kind of wide agreement about there being a lot of cooperation over shared resources, and in fact that there was some data. Aaron Wolf's work out of Oregon State is sort of cited as the main example of this, that there's actually more cooperation than conflict, and part of the reason that it seemed to me that they came to that conclusion is that they were citing numerical instances of transboundary agreements as evidence of cooperation. But one of the things you said was that often those sort of bilateral agreements or state-level agreements are more or less, they just duplicate the power dynamics in the region, and so aren't really an indication necessarily of cooperation because they might just be the same power dynamics that discourage cooperation but put on paper, or they might be very thin agreements. So should we be moving away from that, the idea that there is a widespread cooperation over water resources when the chips are down?
Okay, so a couple of things. First, it's going to depend on your definition of cooperation. Okay, so what's cooperation, right? You can say lack of political tension, right? But that doesn't take into impact the environment, right? You can say we've divided the river and we've gone our separate ways, right? That's cooperation. We're not fighting over it anymore, but that's a political science definition. But if you want to think about the environmental definition of cooperation, where it's an integrated management and protection of the ecosystem, protection of the groundwater, protection of water quality, anticipation of climate change, I would be very hard-pressed to find one treaty in the world that does all of that, right? So in that sense, it would fail, okay? Now, in terms of power, it varies, right? So we heard about Mark Zeytoun's work, excellent work, on the role of power and how it's hidden and the powerful states protect themselves. That's fair, but I'm not quite sure I can say that the powerful people get everything they want throughout these treaties. Because just to bring in South Asia, if I may, India and Pakistan have the Indus Waters Treaty, right? Pakistan can complain, as it's doing now until forever over that treaty, but in fact, it has been able to get water from Western tributaries, and India has in fact restrained itself in developing the Western tributaries so it can get water. The other thing is you can look at Syria and Turkey. Once in a while, Turkey has not fully developed the water resources, so it gives Syria the ability to continue to get the water commitments that it's receiving. But one day, the really true test comes when Turkey really needs that water for the Kurds, for itself, for hydropower generation. What's it going to do? Is it going to continue to send the water down to Syria? Or is it going to say, well, let's negotiate another treaty. I really can't make these treaty commitments. It's a political science question in terms of, will the hegemon harm itself? In the case of Jordan, I would argue that Israel has been generous. It's not a very popular decision, but Israel has been generous, but only because Israel has national interest in Jordan. I can tell you later about that.
So linked to that, one theme that seems to be repeated by the speakers is that we are aware that there are many issues, particularly with regard to transboundary issues, questions between countries. We are aware of that, but we sweep them under the carpet. We're saying, okay, we'll not deal with that now. Let's deal with the other issues. And actually, they're pending. And eventually, one day, I don't want to say they explode, but they would eventually pop up in a way that will need to deal with more seriously. The question, of course, what do we have to say about that? I mean, if this is the reality that we realize, do we have to say something about it as to what we as academic community perhaps can contribute to that issue or not? But maybe we leave this question to the final wrap-up after Seth's presentation. But in the meantime, if there are any more questions addressed to Neda. Yes, Jake. What? Oh.
Just an observation. I hesitate to add a somber footnote to what is already a very rather somber picture of the future, but what you describe as regards the mismanagement of water resources is a very old picture that has repeated itself time again in the region for many of the reasons that you indicate, namely political reasons, the inability to control water resources over the entire length of the channels which were involved, and also the mismanagement on the part of centralized authorities who look to the short run rather than the Caliphate decided to allow their tax collectors to exchange their fiefs when they were no longer economically profitable, which meant, of course, that the water resources that made them profitable, once the area silted up, there was no investment anymore in maintaining these particular areas. This resulted, again, in mass migration from Iraq towards provinces further to the west. It resulted as well in staggeringly poor economic conditions, and ultimately in the dissolution of the power of the Caliphate itself. So when management is required, that is to say, management over an enormously large area, some sort of centralized authority becomes the sine qua non. But in the absence of centralized authority, then one can expect these sorts of unfortunate occurrences, because people begin to think in terms of the short run rather than the long run.
Yeah, that's very fair. I just want to add a caveat also that this is not just the Middle East. I can say the same thing about Pakistan. I can say the same thing about India. I can say the same thing about many countries. I can also say the same thing about Israel until recently, because, and Israel is not perfect. It has a lot of water issues that I can talk to you about later, but farmers are politically powerful. I was in Israel doing research at the Water Commissioner's office, and Nolga Blitz, God rest her soul, she told me when we're taking water away from the farmers, they came to her door knocking down, threatening her life. So farmers wherever tend to be powerful.